practice for female genital cutting. Other groups organise marches about violence against women and child enforced marriages. Tostan's curriculum is learner-centred. They integrate West African proverbs, songs, stories, plays and dances into its pedagogical approach. As the participants gain more experience in the class and practising democratic decision making, they begin to connect human rights in their community, country and eventually the world. Along with all this, the learners become more enthusiastic and involved. As one learner in the Gambia commented, with this Tostan education, we really now have begun to understand that human rights abuses must stop. For example, I saw someone who beat his wife. Since we started this education, he has completely changed. He no longer beats his wife. We now stand together chatting, doing things together. We all now come together like brothers and sisters. Another part of the learning process is poems and songs and things like that, and I've actually put a poem that one of the members has written in your handout. I'm not going to read it out. Often social action can be taken as well. In Dialakpoto, a village in southeastern Senegal, the learners staged a march against domestic violence in response to a case of domestic violence in the village. And there was a really good example of a group exercise that they do, which I'm just going to talk you over because I'm aware that I'm sort of going on a bit. Basically, what they do is they use a ball or an orange or anything spherical, and the facilitator would throw it to one person in the class, and they would throw it back and forward for a few goes. And then what he would do is get them to start throwing it to each other, because a lot of these communities, particularly when they're bringing women in, they really don't have a voice, particularly not if there's men there. The only time they ever really talk is when they're, you know, within each other. They're not really deemed important enough to speak within their community. So what he did was he explained that passing it in between, say, me and Paul is a one-sided conversation, but to basically bring in everyone from the group, they pass the ball around. So in classes after that, someone would shout, make sure everyone gets a pass of the ball if they felt that the conversations were being a little bit too one-sided. Something we probably could have applied in this class at the beginning, I'm sure. Okay, so I'm now going to go on to the Middle East and the Arabian Gulf. Drawing on the theories of transformative potential of education for social change, weaving gender issues into popular education may offer an effective conduit for conscious raising among today's youth. And that's a quote from one of the sources that I used. Again, Middle East, I don't think the literacy rates are as bad, but again, women are definitely, it's definitely a patriarchal society. One of the most obvious surges in activity in non-governmental organisations has been in the area of women's empowerment and gender equality. Political activism in areas such as NGOs has helped to change legislation and reverse prejudices and historic gender-based discrimination. The most important part of the legislation process for social actors is the appropriation of indigenous frames, including language, symbols, and everything that's embedded in these people's culture, so it resonates more with them. This helps to produce good dialogue with those involved that were previously marginalised. Again, we saw that happening in Africa as well. An example of this in the Middle East is the adoption of the feminist movement of an Islamic language due to an Islamic revival in recent decades. That's really hard to say. Some examples of women groups in the Middle East are women living under Muslim rule, which is up there. The Arab Women's Organisation, which started in 2003. After a meeting in 2005 of the AWO, it was decided to bring gender issues into research curricula across all universities in the region. And the trainers were educated in this area first, and then we'd hope this would have a trickle-down effect to the students. Women Without Borders is also a really important one. It has a focus on female empowerment and partners with local academic institutions and women's groups to do this. There's actually a really strange issue with education in the Middle East compared to Africa. In Africa, a woman is deemed far less marriable if she's educated past really secondary school. Whereas in the Middle East, a lot of them get into education to basically find a decent husband because they're deemed more marriable if they're better, the more higher their education is. Okay, so finally, that'll be over soon. Eastern Europe and Scotland. So I read a really good comment about once we get into sort of Europe and Scotland and Britain, the effects and how potently popular education is applied sort of dilutes a little bit, because I suppose Eastern Europe is slightly different than Scotland, but our need for social change is not as imminent as it is for the people that are living in Africa and third world countries in Latin America. We have a far more apparently democratic society, so I think it is diluted a little bit and it's not as applied so fervently because of that. In the mid-1990s in Eastern Europe, there was a growth in women's NGOs. They tended to focus on similar issues, the provision of social services such as healthcare, education, preventing violence against women and domestic abuse, and to increase women's political rights, although this is usually to a lesser degree. In Lithuania, most women's organisations were formed between 92 and 96, obviously after sort of the Cold War and communism and everything like that. Including self-help groups and study centres, the Czech Republic is similar, and immediately after 1989, more than 70 foundations or women's NGOs were formed. A survey in the Czech Republic in 2002 found that more than 1/3 of women consider feminist groups fighting for women's rights to be useless, and much of these negative opinions is due to the concept that feminism is anti-family, anti-child and anti-feminine. And this is something that kept coming up, particularly not so much in third world countries, but particularly in sort of Eastern Europe and our countries. It does have a negative name sometimes, unfortunately, but there is little cooperation between the NGOs in Eastern Europe, unfortunately, as they compete for resources and often focus on the same or similar issues. Although there has been some cooperation over the years in some issues, such as the debates and proposed ban on abortions in Hungary, Poland and Slovenia. And then we're going to move to Scotland. Finally, two known social political groups in Scotland are Engender and Scottish Women's Coordination Group, which have both been involved in campaigns for gender equality, both connected to Westminster and the devolved Scottish Parliament. The best example I found of popular education in Scotland is actually the Adult Learning Project in Edinburgh. And I'm sure Liam mentioned this actually when he lectured us. I'm sure he's worked with them. It's not gender equality based in its mission, but it's a good example of popular education. They have groups focusing on history, democracy, music and land, among others. The learners are encouraged by the facilitators to look at how these areas are applied to Scotland and their role within the community. They encourage them to engage people in their own development as critical and autonomous citizens. A good extract to sum up this project comes from Vernon Galloway writing about the ALP. He comments that throughout his life, Frary tried to convince educators that education is not about the bland acceptance and reproduction of the status quo, but rather that it is a chance to change and transform it. His passing has simply strengthened our own resolve not only to continue his work, but to build it anew in Scotland. While some of the groups I've mentioned here are more politically focused than others, I think this sentiment can be applied to all of them. Sorry to go on that.
Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit of the history of particularly the women's journey through adult education in Scotland. One of the rationales, I guess, is quite often in recent years, the West has been seen to put its values in other cultures, expressing the need for democracy and education sort of our way on our terms. The merits of which are for debate at in another place and time. But certainly we're going to look at how recently have we been this enlightened society where we look around the room and we see Scottish guys are outnumbered. We've got an Australian as well, so definitely so. But how have we got to this stage? Because it's not always been that way. So not going to delve too far back into the mist of time. I'm going to start about the 1700s, the 18th century, and sort of what things happened. And well, there was something very big which I suppose affects us today as Scottish people, or people living in Scotland and studying in Scotland, and that was the Act of Union. And you see the Union Jack there, that's not got the extra red bits, that's when the Irish flag came onto its well, St Patrick's Cross. So that's when England and Scotland came together, 1707. So that had impact. However, although that happened, there were three things that Scotland kept when it became part of Great Britain. One was a separate church, so there's a Church of England and a Church of Scotland. One was its law, Scots law, and the other big one was education, which is you know, something that's been a matter of pride for Scottish groups for ages. Next thing, there were other things happening at that time as well. We had the Act of Union, and then after a little while of that union, some people didn't quite like it. So there was a couple of uprisings. The most famous being the Battle of Culloden. So really, if we look post Culloden, we can really start our journey. So in the late, it's really the late 1700s we're going to pick it up. So through this century, some girls, to talk about younger women for a second, girls were getting educated in secondary school, primary school sort of level. If they had the money, if they were in the right part of the country, if there was the will, that was starting to happen. But higher education, adult education was pretty much a no-no. It was just not happening. The route in, and it's very much maybe a stereotype that still happens today, was midwifery. So coming to the very end of that century, there was opportunities. I'm talking 1790s, very tail end. There was opportunities for women to go to what would be, you know, a higher education establishment, but only to do what was seen as very much a women's role. That was a women's job. One of the places that was offering this was James Anderson's institution, which is now in the present day Strathclyde University. And for a time, actually in the 1800s, it was called Anderson University. But they kind of realised they didn't really have a mandate for that, a charter, and so it became the Royal College, and eventually became Strathclyde, which we might come back to later actually. So moving on, so we've gone through the 1700s and going into the 19th century, the 1800s. As I say, midwifery was that foot in the door. If you were a woman, you want to better yourself, you want to study, you know, past school. That was pretty much as meaty a subject as you were going to get to get lectured in. We quite often feel in Scotland that, you know, we led the world in a lot of things, and inventing things, and you know, the television and penicillin, lots and lots of things, telephone, television. There's lots and lots of things we lay claim to, but actually we were a little bit behind our English neighbours on fighting for women's education. There were moves down south of Hadrian's Wall, down south of the border, sooner, more agitators, I would say, which is interesting. So even in the late 1840s, there was some agitation from women in England. We want to be educated. We want to study at this level. It really started in a big way in Scotland in the 1870s. Click on. In the 1870s, it really kicked on. We've just gone past a lady that I really want to see, but we'll get to see her again in a second. There was a woman called Crystal Macmillan. We should get her in the big shot in a few minutes. That's fine. Crystal Macmillan, who wanted to study medical school. And she was the first Scottish woman to graduate with a medical degree of any real substance in our country's history. There was a group called the Edinburgh Seven in Edinburgh, who were agitators. There was in fact a riot documented by the Scotsman newspaper in one of the lunch halls, I believe, at Edinburgh University. Such was the feeling that women were now ready to study at this level and no longer could be sort of put in a box by men. In Glasgow, there was also the Glasgow Association for the Higher Education of Women, which was sort of running sort of parallel, kind of similar sort of time, and they were pushing hard also. This little excerpt here, I really stumbled across it, but I really love it. It really encapsulates kind of what was happening, and also, as it says, that's what I was saying, that the English were actually a wee step ahead of us, and as I said, we kind of sort of think that we led the way with so many things, but our near neighbours were leading the way. However, University of St Andrews was proposing to provide instruction for women. This is in 1881, so we're getting quite advanced in the 19th century, through the Victorian era. And the big date we're really going to come to in a moment is 1892. So this was 1881, this was 11 years previous to this. This is an American perspective, a New York Times perspective of what was happening. So you were starting to get, women were getting allowed in some places, particularly universities it seemed around London. Yes, you can come here very patronising to this subject, to that subject, but you'll not get a degree out of it. You know, you'll not get to you know, is very, very condescending, very patronising, and very much trying to keep women, I suppose, in their place, because that suited the establishment of the day. So we're moving on from the Victorian era, from Crystal Macmillan and these agitators. They got somewhere, basically. So from 1892, there was women allowed. There were women allowed, sorry, into university education. It's worth mentioning, although we're very much focusing on gender, there were class issues as well. You know, upper class people got to university before middle class people did, working class working men, you know, and so on and so forth. So there were issues of class in there as well as gender. So there was almost two battles going on in parallel. In the 20th century, though, just to keep that 1892 date in your mind, in 1892 women are allowed in. They're going to get the study now because of the likes of Crystal Macmillan and the Edinburgh Seven and the Glasgow Association for Higher Education. These agitators have got women someplace. They can actually get a qualification and it means something. But in the 20th century, just to give an idea of how quickly it went from 1892 to about 1907, 1908 is the next figures. It went from 6% in that very first year to around about 25–26%, so a quarter of the population were female in quite a short time frame. So really, I'm just going to take you through a very quick walk through the 20th century before I pass on to Nikki. So in 1928, which talking amongst the group the other day, you know, that my grandmother